Good evening, everybody. We are so pleased to see your faces tonight. I can't believe that we're all actually here.
It's amazing. It is amazing.
So we have a very special evening for you tonight, and it is the 50th, can you believe it? The 50th reunion of our group of OSU activists, which were loosely known as the Friday Afternoon Tea and Glee Society, which never really existed. There was no tea, but there was a lot of glee. The drummer staff, the alternative newspaper, and all of my dear fellow travelers, I am so pleased to welcome you tonight. We have some very special things to happen for you tonight on the program, but before we get to that, I want to make some introductions. I am Marty Nicholson. When I was here with you in 1965 through 1968, you knew me as Martha Kaufman. And I was loosely connected with the Wesley Foundation, and you will remember that there were quite a group there who caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people, and I was definitely one of them and proud to be so. I'm now here in Oklahoma, and one of a handful who are still residents of the state. And as you know, in this day and age, they need us. They need us. We, as well as our distinguished speakers this evening, I want to introduce you to some other special guests. Mark Ellison, thank you for coming. Former Oklahoma House of Representative Don Davis, who brought our speaker and Marsh. So we thank you greatly, and also for your service to our state. Difficult dialogues. How many of you were there this afternoon? Great thing that they're carrying on that legacy. And let's see, Sue Jacobs, there she is, and Craig Waters. Thank you so very much. We appreciate everything you are doing in the great conversations, and who knows what will bubble up from that. You just never know. With us tonight, but you know, sometimes I have trouble remembering things. Does that ever happen to you? No. So to help us with that, so that we can remember this evening, we are videoing tonight's event. And so we want to thank David Peters and his staff of videographers who will preserve this evening for us. Thank you very much, David. The planning committee, an event like this does not happen without a bit of planning, even a group like ours who is so loosely constructed and so fluid. So I want to introduce you to my colleagues, most of whom you know. Our organizer, Chick Dombach, without whom this would not have happened. Thank you very much. And Ron Stevens, Jim Troxel, Jane Graham, Doug and Sherry Cannon, Caves. Whoops. Doug and Sherry Caves. Sherry was one, Sherry Cannon. Would all of you stand, please? And I will confess that we had more than a little fun doing this. It was truly a joy. Judy Stevens, where are you? There she is. Judy is the master of soundtrack constructor, so we have Judy to thank for our music throughout the weekend. Appreciate that. Mike and Marcia Eisen, who There they are, who also have helped with registration this evening. Thank you very much. So, I have another confession to make, and I'm very sorry to tell you this, but I honestly don't recognize any of you. I am so sorry. I would ask you to do a couple of things for us, and for me especially. Would you introduce yourself to people you don't know, because you might have been my dearest friend. So, and the other thing is, Jane made us these lovely name tags. Let's wear them. It really does help a lot. The other thing you may have noticed is there is a mini program on the back of this. So if you, for some reason, don't hang on to, I've now asked her for 2 of these, I'm pretty sure. But the whole program is lovely and very informative. But we also have that little one on the back there that is helpful. And we have a lot of structured things planned for you. But we also have a lot of unstructured time, because I think probably the deepest meaning of this weekend will come in those informal conversations and those renewals of relationships and the questions that we ask each other. One of the big questions that I've heard asked of various people is, why are you here? You know, it cost a little bit of money, and it cost a little more time, and people are here from all over the place. It wasn't just an hour-and-a-half drive down the turnpike for most of you. So I'm interested in the answer. So if you kind of percolate that around in the back of your head for the weekend, maybe as the weekend progresses, we'll get some answers to that question. We do have some fun things planned. This evening, of course, we want to kind of set some context for the time period when we all came together. Tomorrow morning at the library, we are invited to the archives at 9 o'clock in the morning. You can see some old issues of the Drummers and the O'Cauley and a picture or 2. And there's not enough space for us all in the archive room. So David has also opened up the browsing room, where we can have some informal conversations while people are going out in and out of the archives. Formal, more formal, this group never gets very formal. I dare you to try to make this group be formal. It couldn't happen. Introductions, we're all going to kind of renew who we all are as a group and spend a few minutes introducing ourselves at 10:15 over in the browsing room. So I want you to be there. The group picture with our No Thought Control banner, and I was tasked with bringing the banner. I am glad to report to you that I did remember the banner. So it's here. And we will have a group picture in front of the library with the No Thought Control banner at 12:30 tomorrow. It's not the real one. No. So sorry. The one we'll have for tomorrow came from bannersonthecheap.com. Really, true story, it did.
That seems about right.
But we will have a banner. So dinner tomorrow night at the Hideaway to continue our conversations informally. And then finally the gathering of the tribe on Sunday morning to see what we've been percolating on the answer to that question. I've thought about it a little. For me, you are my touchstones. You are my people. Whether I knew you or not, you are the group who made me who I am today. And I thank you for that. But there were others who made me who I am today. And one of them is our honored guest this evening. We find ourselves at another intersection of history. Back in 1967, 1965, we were looking at three great social movements. The Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, and just a smidge later, and this is why I'm up here, by the way, the women's movement. Someone said we needed a feminine presence. Well, I was kind of the poster child for the women's movement, so that's a good thing here. But we found ourselves at that intersection in that time, and we all made choices about what kind of world we wanted to live in, and who we wanted to be, and what we wanted to do about that. And we had public figures, like our guest tonight, who served with honor and dignity and courage, and who were inspirational to us in that time, which is why we are delighted that our guest is with us this evening. We find ourselves at another great intersection in history, I think, where once again we have to decide, what kind of a world do we want to live in? What kind of a world do we want our children and our grandchildren to inherit? And at this point in our personal journeys, how do we move that needle? Or how do our children and our grandchildren move that needle? How do our public servants move that needle with our support? So under the banner of academic freedom and free speech, we gathered here at OSU. And our speaker was also here at OSU to talk to us about one of the issues of that time, 1967, 1968. An example of true public service. Former U.S. Senator, elected twice from the state of Oklahoma, served from 1964 to 1971, a member of the Kerner Commission on Civil Disorder after the things that happened in our inner cities in the summer of 1967. I refuse to call them riots. I think that was... anyway, I won't make that speech. Ran for president on a populist platform. That means something different today than it did then. Is now widely published author of 19 nonfiction books and 3 novels. University of New Mexico, professor of political science, where he has lived since. And with him on the stage, I am going to turn the microphone over to another colleague of ours who is an attorney, practiced until 1997, was the campaign manager for our guest this evening. No, was on the Senate campaign, and was on the Washington staff of the senator. So, gentlemen, give us some context. Hank?
Thank you.
I give you Hank Hankla and Fred Harris.
Thank you. We did a sound check earlier. Is that carrying okay? Is it on? Good. I'll back on.
Yeah.
I want you to know I'm really happy to be back here. It's been 20 years since I've been back on campus, and it's been a lot of change. You know, I grew up in Boise City, and after I quit practicing law, there wasn't much of a reason for the credit card to come all the way down here, because you fly into Amarillo and then drive to Boise City, and where there's family events or funerals, it wasn't just a hop, skip, and a jump down here. I'm glad to be back and to see all the changes in town. I got to Washington some of you know, after we graduated, I went to work on Mike Monroney's campaign staff and had this master plan that I would get to know all of the people who were related to Washington, and after we won, I would go back to Washington, they'd help me get a job. But, as he said, we came up a few feet short of the runway, and I just had to pack up my car and drive up there anyway and start walking around and talking to people. And I went into the senator's office and talked to them on, I guess, the first day, and they said they'd be glad to help me if they could. And after a while, they took pity on me and took me in. And I was there and able to say that how proud I was to be able to, that I was working for Fred Harris, who was clearly the smartest man in the Senate. And it was a great opportunity. I think, from my point of view, our weekend is a lot about remembering the events of that time, of reflecting on them, and giving some assessment of what they meant to us and what they mean going forward. All the questions I have for the senator would kind of be in the same context. We set in context for those times, because they were tumultuous times for us, and maybe even more tumultuous than today. It's hard to remember that they were, but the country was coming apart at the seams, it seemed like. We're particularly glad to have the senator here with us because of his catbird seat in observing all of that. And the senator was born in Walters, Oklahoma, southwest Oklahoma, Cotton County town of about 2,000, twice as big as Boise City. And was a champion from the early on, graduated top of his class, was state champion FFA, then went to OU and OU Law School. I never figured out how you got out of law school in 2 years and were top of the class. I guess that was just another mark there. And then set up his own law firm, became a powerhouse. He actually ran for the state house while he was in law school just to kind of learn the ropes of it all, I guess. Was elected to the state legislature in 56 to the state Senate, and was the youngest member of the state Senate, 26-year-old. I guess you were 25 when you were elected and turned 26 a few days later.
Right.
And was within a few years named as one of the top 10 young men in the state by the Oklahoma JCs. In 62, he made a run for governor, but wasn't successful. But then in January 1st, 1963, you'll remember that Bob Kerr passed away, and Governor J. Howard Edmondson resigned from governorship, moving up Lieutenant Governor Nye, who then appointed J. Howard to serve the balance of that term in the Senate. And then the election came up a year and a half later. Now, how many of you remember, but that at that time, there were a number of people in that primary, and in the primary, first round of the primary, J. Howard Edmondson actually had the most votes, but he didn't win a majority. So it came down to a runoff with the senator who then cleaned his clock and moved on to challenge Bud Wilkinson, who was an icon in the state. And as they used to say, it may have taken Schlitz to make Milwaukee famous, but it took Fred Harris to make Budweiser. Being elected to the Senate, he was the youngest senator in the history of the state of Oklahoma at 33. His continued hard work. In 65, the national JCs named him one of the top 10 young men in the country. In the Senate, he served on the Finance Committee as a pivot, Small Business Committee, Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired the Research Committee, and did enormous hard work. And then, of course, the Kerner Commission we'll talk about in a little bit, 72 and 76 running for president. Senator, I want you to know what an honor it is for you to join us and for me to be asked by my colleagues here to be the one asking you the questions. Now, first of all, when you were born in Cotton County, it was a period of the Dust Bowl and the Depression.
Yeah.
And yet you came out of that with a fire for excellence and for achievement that very few people ever have in life. Where'd that come from?
You know, I don't know. I really don't know. I remember when I was about a junior in high school, I took a speech class, and one thing, we had a little exercise where you were supposed to memorize and recite some Shakespeare passage. And I chose a speech from Shylock from Merchant of Venice. That one about if you prick a Jew, won't they bleed, and so on. I didn't know what a Jew was. So I changed it to a Negro. Now, I don't know how I came to have, my dad was from Mississippi, and how I came to have different views, and a lot, I think it had to do with teachers. I had some awfully good teachers, and that I think it's a terrible thing we're doing these days, bashing teachers and not supporting public education like we ought to. I don't know where all that came from, but it was fun growing up in Cotton County. We were poor, but as people always say, you know, we didn't know we were that poor. Everybody was sort of in the same boat. Somebody was asking me last night, isn't it funny that all these politicians talk about growing up so poor? You know, how does that kind of thing produce people? I'm darned if I know. I said, well, but you've got to have a story like that, you know. The best I've heard is the guy said, I wasn't born in a log cabin, but we moved into one as soon as we could afford it. I don't know how. When I went to the university, a whole new world kind of opened up for me. And there were some law students that I got into, somebody got me into a club which doesn't exist anymore. It was Congress Literary and Debating Society. And it was a year older than the university. These law students just kind of adopted me. I was a freshman, and they had a process where each week when they met, they had a different thing. Like, for example, that first meeting I went to, people put topics in a hat, and you drew out a topic, and you had to give a 5-minute speech on it. And I drew out a topic, my first meeting, and I hadn't been at the university, you know, but a month or so, and it was mandatory arbitration in labor disputes.
You had a lot of call for that in Walters, I know. Right?
Well, I thought mandatory. I'm surely not for something mandatory.
That's a good signal.
And for the life of me, scared as I was, I could not think of the word employer. So I kept saying boss. Well, these left-wing law students loved me. You know, I was talking about the bosses and so forth. But the university had a great deal to do with it, and my association with those guys who turned out to be lifelong friends.
Yeah, I appreciate it. The next question was about whether or not you'd had individual events that molded you toward your civil rights commitments. I was glad to have him expound. We were talking earlier about Senator Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader while the senator was in the Senate. And Mike was known for driving Meet the Press people crazy. His standard answer was yep and nope. And I said, I think I'm comfortable because I don't think the senator will do that to me today.
That was never my problem.
When you arrived in the Senate, it was in the wake of a number of major events that really stirred the pot in the country. Some negative, some positive, but they all stirred it, depending on your point of view. We had Brown versus Boards of Education and the continuing riling of that across the country. We had Little Rock and George Wallace standing in the door in Alabama. We'd had the Kennedy assassination. We had Madeleine Murray O'Hare and her case in the Supreme Court that it's unconstitutional to have Bible readings in schools. We had the Poor People's March, Martin Luther King's speech, and we had the start of Vietnam just shortly before. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin was only months before you came. But we also had the height of the accomplishments of the Great Society. You'd passed the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act.
That's right.
And one of the things that struck me as I was going over these questions was that you weren't known as a firebrand yet, but you were, but you were, we know from you and in your heart, you had that fire for the things you believed in. And yet you came into the Senate with committee chairs who were almost all old bulls, Southern Democrats.
That's right.
Almost all, I think Yarborough was the only Southern state Democrat that voted for the Civil Rights Act. Richard Russell led the filibuster on the floor that was 60 days. The things that he and Jim Eastland said on the floor were their own version of segregation now and segregation forever. And that must have been daunting as you came in with an agenda to do better for all the people. How did you deal with, how did you think about the strategy you're going to use to work on legislation with people who had just done things that must have offended you?
Well, but there was a lot of good guys there, too.
Were. and those guys had some good sides and things that they did, too.
And also, there were a lot of good Republicans in those days. was it Will Rogers said, everybody is good for something. He said, even a Republican, at least they could serve as a bad example, you know. But no, in those days there was, for example, when I first went to the Senate, there was not a Republican member of the Senate from any of the 11 old Confederate states. They were all Democrats. Right. But they're virtually all racist, highly conservative Democrats. Yes. Now they've been replaced by more conservative Republicans.
Some of those chairs, or people we may have thought of as liberal, Bill Fulbright voted against civil rights, but was a great liberal on international issues. But
liberals justified the bill on the basis that, well, that's the only way he can get reelected. But I think, as McCarthy once said, Gene McCarthy once said to me, I think he actually was comfortable with his views on civil rights.
Yeah. Well,
Dick Russell, for example, I went down one time to visit with Dick Russell, one of the Senate buildings named after him now. He was the most powerful member.
The one that you had your office in.
Yeah.
The old Senate office building is now the Russell office building.
Yeah, in those days it was called the old SOB building.
That's right.
It really was. Old Senate office building.
Senate office building.
we later
old SOB applied to a lot of people too, but it was...
I went down one time to visit Dick Russell he was the most powerful member of the Senate still, in Winder, Georgia, where he lived. And I always assumed, you know, that he had led every effort against civil rights legislation, against anti-lynching legislation, anything. And I thought, well, he feels that's his constituents' views and so forth. But he was living in this little town, sort of in the plantation manor house, and with black servants. He was not married, lived alone there, and was really sort of the master of that little town. And I came to the view that he was quite comfortable with his views. This was not politics with Dick Russell. But what I started to say was there were people like in the Senate in those days, like Ed Brooke, who was a very close friend of mine, a Republican, African-American member of the Senate from Massachusetts, and he and I were on the Kerner Commission together later. There were people like Jacob Javits of New York and Mac Mathias of Maryland. So, but those countertypes disappeared. The hard right Democrat gone, replaced by a harder right Republican in many cases, and those the liberal or progressive even member of the Senate who is a Republican, and the House the same, they've gone as well. So that today, as you know, every vote in the House or Senate is a party line vote. Majority of one party voting against the majority of the other party, and often unanimous on each side. It is the whole country is like that now too, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But it makes Washington a really mean place and tough to get anything done.
It is. In that situation, did you have senators that were mentors to you?
Not so much in the Senate. My closest friends in the Senate were Robert Kennedy and Walter Mondale. We were seatmates from the very first. You should remember that the 2 years before I was elected, there was a surge of new Democratic members of the Senate.
Right.
And then with my election, more. So we had a very good majority, even with leaving out the Southerners. And you could pick up some Republicans on most issues. And so we were able to pass the Voting Rights Act and federal aid to education.
When it took 67 votes to break cloture.
That's right.
You did that.
Even in those, in those days, and it does still on legislation. But at any rate, they had to put a back row, a new back row in the Senate on the Democratic side for our class. And so we were, Robert Kennedy and Mondale and I were seatmates, and we never moved in the Senate. Your seat is assigned on the basis of seniority in your party. We never moved until the three of us could move together. And people, even in those days, you know, they talked about other senators as their friends, but they weren't friends. They were more like business associates. But we three were really friends. I lived around the corner from Robert, and we visited back and forth. He came to Oklahoma, and I went to Hyannisport and New York. Mondale the same way. So it was really more contemporaries that I spent a lot of time with. One time I got sort of dragged into going to this prayer breakfast that John Stennis of Mississippi led. And they called on me for prayer at first. I never went back.
Well, you were pretty good extemporaneously.
It was hard for me. It was hard for me to do it. I came out of the Baptist church down in Lawton, and Tom, the preacher down there, he preached against John Kennedy from the pulpit, and Luther Eubanks, whom I later appointed to the federal bench, and he and I and a bunch of other people confronted him and said, you know, if you're going to talk politics from the pulpit, then we're going to have to organize and have some political activity here ourselves. And I don't think Tom was against the preacher. I don't think he was against John Kennedy because he was Catholic, really. I mean, that was part of it. But he was against him because he was a liberal.
Yep.
And that we had a lot of that in those days. But the good thing about the Baptist church in those days, when I first got elected, I read the Baptist Messenger religiously, which is a good way to read the Baptist Messenger. And we were against, the Baptist church was officially against, in Oklahoma, the prayer in the schools, prescribed prayer in the schools. So when I first went there, that was a fairly easy vote for me. But I mean, it got
That
me
was an
there.
issue in your race against Pat Patterson.
That's right. I think Everett Dirksen the Republican leader made us vote, I think 9 times on amending the Constitution to allow prescribed prayer and so forth. And I voted against it every time. And I was down at Wynnewood at a town meeting one time after that, and this old cowboy guy got up and he said, Fred, he said, why won't you let our kids pray in the schools? Well, you haven't got a paragraph even, maybe a little sentence. So I started off by saying, well, you know, the First Amendment. And he said, well, don't you believe in majority rule? And I said, well, yes, I believe in majority rule. And he said, well, the majority of us down here want our kids to be able to pray in the schools. Well, that's kind of hard to. Later on, there's a guy, Gail McGee, got reelected from Wyoming in the next 2 years. And he had an ad. I wish I'd have thought of this. He had a television ad where it starts out with a close shot on the Bible, and you can read the words as a voiceover is reading them, and it says, when you pray to your Father who's in heaven, be in secret, and pray in secret, and so forth. And then the camera's widening out the whole time, and then you see it's Gail McGee. And he looks into the camera and says, that kind of prayer has never been outlawed. Well, I thought, why didn't I think of that?
I thought it was you that said that you believed as long as there were algebra tests, there would always be prayer in school.
Well, luckily I did not have a tough opponent. That is, running against me. I was elected first to an unexpired term, so I had to run again in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And this guy, he couldn't afford much television, which was a lucky break, but he had a radio ad where it started out with a little girl's voice, sound like maybe she's in the 3rd grade or something, and she is saying, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And as she's reciting that prayer, you hear the you hear the sirens of a police car. Thy will be done on earth. And the screecher breaks, and then a man's voice says, "Stop. Fred Harris will not allow our children to pray in the school." Plus the Baptist church changed on me too.
Yeah. Well, it's one of you're talking about the difficulty there. I want to talk about one of the signature successes you had in the Senate was the passage of the return of Blue Lake.
Yes.
It was 80,000 acres. It was returned to the Taos Pueblo Indians. And it was opposed by Scoop Jackson, who chaired the Interior Committee, and by Clinton Anderson, who was the senior senator from New Mexico.
Right.
And yet you got it through. Now, I understand that when he signed it, Nixon said, "I can't believe I'm signing a bill that Fred Harris sponsored."
That's right, he actually did, yeah.
We could probably learn some lessons from how you maneuvered to get a bipartisan effort to get something through that you believed in.
And I should have mentioned probably a while ago, some people have said maybe you were affected by the fact you grew up among Comanche Indians, as I did, and married a Comanche Indian, and my 3 children enrolled. So that maybe has something to do with, how I feel about race and ethnicity. But there were 5 old men who were the leaders of Taos Pueblo. They came to see me. What had happened was almost 30 years earlier, the Court of Claims had held that Teddy Roosevelt, the president, just by a stroke of the pen, illegally had taken their sacred Blue Lake land, 48,000 acres, and this lake is a sacred place for them. And they were awarded damages in money. That's all the statutes allowed them to do. But the Taos Pueblo said, "We don't want the money. We want the land." And luckily, it was in the national forest. It wasn't privately held. So they tried and tried and tried. And somehow somebody sent them to me. And Fred Gibson, whom I'm going to see tomorrow, Don knows, was on my staff, and he and I met with them. They had to go through interpreter, and they convinced me that this was really a sacred thing for them, very, very basically important. And I said to Fred Gibson that day, I said, if we don't do another thing, let's get these people their land back. And it was tough. Clinton Anderson was a senior senator from New Mexico. He had been head of the committee that Scoop Jackson then headed, Interior. And what I decided to do was just hold up everything that came out of that committee until we could get a vote on this.
That was gutsy.
So George McGovern was chair of the subcommittee on Indian Affairs, but he couldn't, or felt he couldn't, stand up to these people. They're very powerful people, and so they had me meet with them. They were going to hotbox me, as they say, get me in there, just us, the Democrats on that committee, in a closed meeting. And old man Anderson said to me, he had a bill that just was to give them the use of the land from time to time, but the sacred where they did their ceremonies. He said to me, if you don't agree to go for this bill, why, there won't be any bill. And so I said, well, Senator, I'm going to make the Senate vote on this. One way or another, they're going to have to vote on it. And that's what we eventually did. Mondale said to me later, how did you do that? And I said, how did you get that thing passed? And I said, well, every now and then, what it shows is that to get anything done around here, you just got to be a son of a bitch. Mondale said, you're right, and you're well suited for it.
Did you move to make a rider when you were on the floor? How did you get it out?
Well,
if you didn't go through committee, how did you do it?
One other thing, we subverted Nixon himself for a problem. There was a woman on his staff who we'd met a long time ago, and she and got her involved, and she got some of the better people on Nixon's staff involved, and they convinced Nixon that here was a way he could do something good for Indians, and it wouldn't cost any money. Mm-hmm.
I can see the attraction for that.
So, but that's why he tried to back out later, though, because Jackson told him that they would not support him on the anti-ballistic missiles if he continued his support. But the staff talked him into staying on the can. Anderson said to me, "I don't mess with your Indians, and you ought not to mess with my Indians." Here I'm in Oklahoma, I'm coming over there to New Mexico messing with his Indians. But I don't think there's anything that I've done that has proved to be as much a blessing to me.
Well, when I read it, I just marveled at your ability to get that through and how rare that was then and certainly is now. I want to move on to our college years, and they were years of a lot of tumult. 64 to 68 was my period here on campus. It was generally the same for all of us. Some wise man said that the violence doesn't occur when a people are beaten to the bottom. It occurs when hope has been raised up and then it's squashed. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a lot of people who think that after the passage of Martin Luther King's speech, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, there was a lot of hope in a lot of communities. But in 66 and 67, not only did we have violence in the cities, we had free speech movement in Berkeley. I was going to say, I think there was a fourth movement that was happening about the time. The student movement across the country were taking over things. We had anti-war protests that were beginning to get pretty intense around the country. And then we had 159 cities in which there were riots between April and December of 67. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us to remember how scary that was to how many people. I think we didn't have the intense television coverage to be able to see it, but that was scary to a lot of people. And the worst, of course, was Detroit, where the city burned for 5 days. There were 43 people killed, 352 people were injured, 1,400 buildings were burned, 7,000 National Guard and Army troops were brought in to settle it down. Now, as I understand the story, you were watching this and upset about it, decided you could go to the floor and introduce a bill to set up a commission. You did that. Overnight, you realized that it didn't take legislation. You could just call the president. Mm-hmm. And he thought it was a good idea, and he then set up the Kerner Commission and appointed you, along with 10 others, to be on it. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, officially. It was a good mix of members, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Otto Kerner of the governor of Illinois, was the chair. John Lindsay, who was then mayor of New York. Ed Brooks, senator from Massachusetts. James Corn is congressman from California. Dorn McCullen is a Republican congressman. Roy Wilkins from the NAACP. I.W. Abel from the Steel Workers. Charles Thornton from Litton Industries. Herbert Jenkins.
Chief of Police in Atlanta.
Yes, Chief of Police of Atlanta, right. Catherine Pedden, who's Pedden, who was the Commissioner of Commerce in Kentucky.
Right.
Broadsped, you spent 7 months, presented a 426-page report.
Right.
And it was thorough and scathing. Main line that's been repeated often from it was that we're one nation moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. As I understand, the Commission's basic conclusion was that the riots were a result of lack of economic opportunity. But there were a lot of historical factors that built into housing, education, employment opportunities.
Right.
Can you talk about the process of discovery for you? Maybe are there new things you discovered you hadn't thought about before? How you worked together? What some of those issues were in those areas?
Yeah, Alan Crumley was the Daily Oklahoman. I think is about the only reporter we had from Oklahoma that was permanently in Washington. He was writing for the Daily Oklahoman. And the day we came out with this report, talking about the ghettos have been caused by white racism, and they've been sustained by white racism. We talked about the wretched poverty and so forth. And he said to me, he said, "You support this?" I said, "I helped
write it."
he couldn't believe it. I was on a committee, Abe Ribicoff headed, Senator Ribicoff and Robert Kennedy and I were on it, and we were involved. We'd already been involved in city problems and so forth with hearings. And the Detroit riots were at their height. And I went to the Senate and I got Mondale to co-author a joint resolution to create a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission to not only look at the law and order aspects, but also the fundamental causes, wretched poverty and racism that had caused these things. And I had it sent to a subcommittee that I chaired. Yeah. And I held hearings the next day. I got Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was not then a senator, and Whitney Young, who was head of the Urban League, to testify for it. And then, as you said, it occurred to me President Johnson could appoint this commission himself. We wouldn't have to wait for congressional action. So I got word to him about that, wrote a letter. There's a guy writing a book about all this, a fellow named Steve Gillen. Is going to be a really big book, come out on the anniversary of the Kerner report, March 1st, 2018. Anyway, and he found all this, the letter and so forth that I had written to Johnson at the time. So soon Johnson announced, it was announced that Johnson was going to have nationwide broadcast to appoint this kind of a commission. And so we put a television in our living room and got some neighbors and friends to come over and we want to watch the president. About, I don't know, 10 minutes maybe before he was to go on the air, my youngest daughter, then in the 3rd grade, I think, she came running out of the kitchen where we had a wall telephone, and she said, "Daddy, President Johnson's on the phone for you." And I said, "Well, is it a secretary or is it the president?" She said, "No, he said, this is President Johnson. Let me talk to your daddy." That caused a pretty good stir in the living room. So I ran in there to the kitchen, picked up the phone, you know. "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I hope you're going to watch television tonight." This is word for word. And I said, "Yes, we are." He said, "I'm going to appoint that damn commission you've been talking about." And I said, "Well, I'm glad. That's a thing to do." He said, "And I'm going to put you on it." And I said, "Well, I didn't expect that, but I'll do the best I can." He said, "Now don't be like some of your colleagues." He said, "I appoint them to things and they never show up." I said, "No, I'll show up." He said, "And another thing, Fred." I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I want you to remember you're a Johnson man." I said, "Yes, sir, I am a Johnson man." He said, "If you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank.
Yeah.
I went back in the living room and people said, "What did he say? What did he say?" I said, "Well, some of it was kind of personal." The sad thing, he used almost the same words that I had said about we not only got to do something about how to prevent riots and how to quell them and so forth, but we've got to get at these underlying causes. He said that in the point. He said, "Let your search be free and answer these questions, these 3 questions." And the sad fact is, he thought I did forget I was a Johnson man. And he thought what happened from the very first, John Lindsay and I, here I come from a little town, 2,000 population, where no black people lived. I think at one point maybe the law prevented them from living there. And here's John Lindsay, the head of this huge city. We just found each other as believing in the same things, and we became a team that led that commission, as Gillen is going to point out in this book. For example, we first had 20 days of hearings. Had 140 people from J. Edgar Hoover to Martin Luther King Jr. And then we divided into teams. John and I were a team, and went out to riot cities and just walked the streets and talked to people. And then we had, I got us a meeting room on the Senate side of the Capitol, because there were 4 of us in the Congress, and made it easy. We met for 40 days, 44 days, and we read aloud and voted on every word in that report. A lot of them were tough votes, 6 to 5. We had a lot of 6 to 5 votes. And we eventually, though, by the time we got through, everybody was on the same page, at least that day, and it was a unanimous report. David Ginsburg, the wonderful person who was our executive director, said it was a unanimous report adopted by a vote of 6 to 5. We made a bad mistake of not having our hearings in the public where the press and others could, and having press people go with us to see through our eyes what we saw. And so we decided that we'd put it out the report with an embargo to give us time to background, to get people to see it the way we saw it, so it wouldn't be such a shock, because we're talking about huge, massive new federal programs, jobs and education. And we said the word racism. That was a 6 to 5 vote. People said, Lyndon Johnson believed, as he said to me many times, I'd go down to the White House. One time I went down to the White House with Mike Monroney, the other senator, to take Jane Ann J. Rowe, who was Oklahoma's Miss America, to see the president. President, he said, "How are you, Mike? How are you, Miss Jane Rowe?" And he said, "How are you, Fred?" He said, "I'm surprised to see you up." Yes. I said, "What?" He said, "I heard old John Lindsay has you down and has his foot on your neck." Afterwards, I said, "I want to talk to you some more about this." He said, Johnson believed that it was a conspiracy. You know, it's kind of like in the old days with about talking about these outside agitators. You know, our black people are happy. You know, if it weren't for these agitators. He believed that these riots were organized and planned and that there was a conspiracy behind them. And I said to him, I knew he was a student of Franklin Roosevelt, I said, "It's not like that, Mr. President." I said, there are thousands of Stokely Carmichaels and H. Rap Browns that you and I never heard of. I said, who knows what would have happened in Roosevelt's day with the conditions as bad as they were, unless he responded to doing something about those conditions. He said, "Have you read the FBI reports?" I said, "Well, I haven't read the actual reports on each riot, but we've had J. Edgar Hoover in to talk to us." Well, he said, talking to Marvin Watson, "Get Fred these FBI reports." And I read them, and you could tell the FBI had not the slightest idea what was happening in the country. And they would say, like Cambridge, Maryland, I remember, a source close to this bureau reports that H. Rap Brown was here last week or the preceding week and was agitating and so forth. Well, by the time it got up to the President's night reading, which was one page, there wasn't any question about it. H. Rap Brown was out there causing the riot. And so he believed all that. Anyway, he would not see us. We wanted to have a meeting where we would present him with our report, President Johnson, and ask for 6 months more of life so we get a chance to lobby for our recommendations and so forth. But a member of the commission, I think, talked to a House member from Texas, a friend of the president, who told the president, staff told us this thing is going to ruin you. It condones, it encourages riots, and it doesn't have a good word to say about anything you've done in favor of civil rights and against poverty, which was all of which was false. But Johnson never believed it, and he rejected. But a lot of good people did agree with it, and we made progress, I think, on race and poverty for about 10 years or so, and then we began to, the progress stopped and changed. I'm in the process right now, together with a man named Alan Curtis. I've done this before with him on anniversaries. We've just sent in a manuscript, an update of the Kerner report for the 50th anniversary, which will come out in March the 1st again. And what we see is that our cities and schools are resegregated again, and in some ways worse. And in addition to that, there's more poverty than there was then. Poverty is harder to get out of now than it was then. Far worse inequality of income than was true before. And somehow I think we've got to get people to see that that's the way it is. I think a lot of people think, well, civil rights, we took care of all that, and poverty, we did that, but we hope that maybe we can get these issues back on the agenda again.
Well, in the last few years, after Ferguson and Baltimore and other cities, it's reminded us that those problems are still with us and we haven't addressed them.
We had a lot to say about police.
Yeah.
We were for what came to be called community policing. Every one of these cities had all white police who came in to enforce the law, in a sense, against the people in there. Rather, people have to see the law as their law, the law that they helped to make and enforce. And so we made progress on that with toward community policing. We were against the militarization of the police. We thought that these tanks and water cannons and automatic rifles and all that had no place in that kind of setting. And on that too, we made progress for a while. But I think a lot of us are like. I saw a folk singer one time here in Oklahoma City. It took him a long time to tune up his guitar, and he had a kind of a patter while he was doing it. He said, and one of the things I remember he said was, "If I ever get this thing tuned again, I'm going to weld it." and I think that's the way a lot of us are. You think, well, why can't we just get this settled? And so, well, we're not going to get it settled. And I just want to say this about you all. It's my wife, Margaret Elliston, my wife of 35 years, here with me, is that she's the chair of Sandoval County Democratic Party in our county. And after this last election, where so many of our friends are, after we got off the ledge, we had to help talk off the ledge. She said it's a lucky break that her undergraduate degree is in political science and her advanced degree is in counseling. It really worked. But people kept asking us, what can we do? And I said, my mother always said, brighten the corner where you are. Everybody can do something. Maybe it's Planned Parenthood that you're interested in, or ACLU, or whatever. We're not sure that it's going to work, or work quick. But I think there's something that's humanizing for yourself. You become more human if you're trying to do something about.
In New Populism, you talked a lot about the social contract.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so pleased to be here with this group. You had a lot of influence on me, and I'm glad you see you're still at it.
You said that the people have to understand it's in their self-interest to agree the principles of the social contract. Otherwise, the people will be neither fully secure nor fully satisfied.
That's right.
There are probably a lot of reasons why the social contract has eroded as much as it has. What do you think are the main reasons and his ideas of how to get it back?
Well, this is just such a bewildering world for a lot of people.
Yeah.
For God's sake, a black guy is president of the United States. What's happening to our world? Almost had a woman. But also, you take what's happened with automation. This was already happening when we were walking around these streets back then, 50 years ago. The jobs are disappearing. We've found this huge surge of people coming in from the South from almost criminally inferior schools, and they come in looking for jobs, and they got there about the time the jobs were disappearing. They're moving away to other countries or just disappearing altogether. And here these people don't have the education to get the good jobs, and about all there was. The new jobs are close by were flipping hamburgers or whatever. That is hard. It's easy to say, as we saw in this last election. You say to coal miners, "We're going to bring coal mining back." Well, coal mining is not going to come back. I mean, the market, among other things, doesn't allow it. Natural gas has taken over in the meantime, but somebody needs to talk to people about that. What are we going to do for people who have been made, as the English say, redundant, and want to work, even in those kind of jobs which were terribly unsafe and unhealthy? I saw a thing the other day about if the present trend of automation happens, within 20 years, every plant will have one man and a dog. The man will be there to feed the dog. And the dog will be there to be sure the man keeps his hand off the machinery. Well, that's a terrible thing. You're 50 years old, you don't have a job, and you're never again going to have. A lot of those 50-year-olds are never again going to have a job that makes pay. And I've been talking with people in the old days, you know, who had come to Detroit, got a job in the automobile industry. They could have a good middle-class life, home, send their kids to college, and so forth.
And have a pension.
Yes, and have a good retirement. Those days are gone, and we got to respond to people like that. We got to help them, and you know, when we made progress in the field of civil rights, for example, it was a time when you had a growing economy, and when there wasn't so much competition for jobs. Now we're in a much tighter economy, and we've gone exactly the wrong way. We cut taxes for the rich people, cut out programs that help middle-class people, and they've fallen out of the middle class. Daniel Webster thought, you know, that it's hard to have a democracy without a really strong middle class. He said that democracy depends upon people not being so rich that they could buy other people, or people so poor that they had to sell. And I'm afraid we're more and more like that today.
I think we could go on this tack for about 5 days. And I'm going to reserve for the questions for any of you to follow up anything further on Kerner Commission or on the economics. I want to ask one last question that's relevant to specifically the time that we were here, and then right after. That's with regard to the Vietnam War. You were not in the Senate yet when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed. I think 3 months or something before you got there.
Preceding year, yeah.
And there are only 2 senators who voted against it. They both lost their jobs in the next election. And in 1969, the mobilization to end the war in Vietnam was organized across the country. And in October of that year, there were rallies in cities around the country. In November, we had the big march on Washington. But in October of that year, you accepted an invitation to speak down here. Mm-hmm. And you gave your first speech officially breaking with the Nixon administration. Now, a couple of years ago, I requested a copy of that speech from your files at OU, and I was amazed at how mild it was.
Really?
Well, it wasn't calling people names, and it wasn't, you know, I mean, it was a reasonable discourse about whether or not we're achieving the goals we are, and it's worth the treasury and the blood.
Right.
But hellfire was rained down on you after that.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how your thinking developed on Vietnam up to that time and what you think the fallout was?
Well, it developed too slowly, my position against the war. I went, as I've said at other occasions, I went to the United States Senate with all of the expertise in national security policy and economic policy that 8 years in the Oklahoma State Senate gives a person. And then I got really bogged down in the Kerner Commission. And I was just thinking the other day, somebody was interviewing me on NPR, and they played me a speech, a telephone call between Lyndon Johnson and Mayor Daley of Chicago. And now, this was at a time when earlier, we were down at the White House maybe every 2 weeks at least, and you have a briefing with the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Secretary of Defense, and McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, you know, he had everything quantified, you know, the body count, how many people been killed, how many weapons had been captured, and so forth. And it looked like we're winning the war. Well, I just read a terrific book which I recommend to you. It's called Way, H-U-E, and it's really well done and interviews everybody from all sides. How at a time when we were being told, you know, we're decimating the enemy's people and weapons and so forth. They were able on the Tet Offensive, to attack 100 different places in Vietnam. It was a really pivotal thing in the war. It showed everything was false. All the body count stuff was false and so forth. And that was happening, incidentally. I was thinking about this with Johnson. We were coming out with our report in late February. It was leaked out on February the 29th. And in late February, that's when the Tet Offensive was. Johnson was dealing with the Tet Offensive. And then Sam Brown, who was a guy that I was involved with when I came here to speak on that moratorium against the war. Sam Brown reminded me on the phone the other day, it was also when the Johnson was running for re-election in the New Hampshire primary at that very same time. So he was really feeling, he also thought not only that there's a conspiracy behind these riots, but he thought the communists some way were behind these anti-war things. I mean, it was all kind of, he was really feeling, as Bill Moyers has said.
Well, J. Edgar had fed him a pretty good line on that.
And he's feeling very, very paranoid. Anyway, this thing he says to Mayor Daley, he says, I appointed this Kerner Commission, Kerner from Illinois, and he said they spent $2 million studying these riots, and now they're recommending that I spend $80 billion. And he said, I don't know where to get the money. I can't get the money. Well, that was at the time I saw saying his defense. You kind of realize the situation, what he was up against. And it's sad, too, I think, because Lyndon Johnson did more for civil rights and against poverty than any president before or since. And it's just really a tragic thing that he somehow got misled on the Kerner thing. Anyway, Clarence Cunningham, this group had a lot of influence on me in regard to this war. And there's some fellow named professor of history named Richard Lowry wrote a book about me. And the strangest thing was he sent it to the University of New Mexico Press to publish, or he hoped they'd publish it. And the press head of the press was a close friend of mine, and he said, what would you think? The University Presses has to put out a manuscript for to be read by somebody else to give an opinion whether they should publish. He said, Fred, what would you think if I gave this manuscript to LaDonna to read? In meaning, I'm going to let you read the manuscript and tell me what you think, which is what we did. I made a lot of notes on it and so forth, and this guy forever, he kept calling the head of the press and said, who did this? I said, well, we keep that confidential. But anyway, one of the things that said that his sister, Catherine, had a great deal of influence on Fred Harris being against the war. And I read that in the manuscript. I thought, my sister Catherine didn't know there was a war. But I looked up the footnote, and it referred to a note that I remembered it. One day I was presiding, and I wrote a note back to my daughter, Catherine. And I called her sister. That's what we called her. And she had come to my house with a group from Harvard. She went the first 2 years down at OU and then to Harvard. And they stayed, this whole group, they were there to protest the war. And they stayed at my house and that night before the thing. And they were all prepared. They had Vaseline, and they had stuff prepared in case they get tear gas and all that. And it did impress me that they're fighting our battles, these kids. And Clarence Cunningham used to impress me a great deal too. But when Mondale and I were involved in the Humphrey campaign, we got an agreement out of Humphrey that he was going to break with Johnson publicly on the war. he called us one day and we were off the Senate floor, and and he read us a speech he was going to give, calling for a bombing halt and a de-Americanization of the war, and it was in the words of a speech that had been given lately in Worcester by a Harvard professor. And we said, don't change a word. That he was about to give that speech. This was along in May or June before the Democratic Convention. And just as we left, Mondale turned back to him and said, you have to clear this with the president, Johnson. Humphrey was vice president. And he said, no, this I'm doing this as a candidate, not as vice president, so I don't have to. Well, the speech, days passed, the speech wasn't given, and so forth. And we eventually found out that Johnson said to him, he did talk to Johnson, and Johnson said, you're going to get thousands more American boys killed if you do this. We've got a chance to settle this war, and you do that, you're going to totally weaken our chance to, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but it stopped Humphrey. So we got to the convention in Chicago then, and we wrote another a new platform plank, which was even tougher about getting out of the war in Vietnam, and Humphrey approved it. And my job was to take it around the convention to some of the conservative governors, and Hale Boggs, Representative Hale Boggs, who was chair of the platform committee, and get their agreement. And I went to Hale Boggs first. David Ginsburg, who had been our executive director on the Kerner Commission, went with me. And Boggs said to me, well, you look me in the eye and you tell me that's what Humphrey wants. And I said, this is what he wants. So he said, all right, that we'll get it, it'll be in the platform. And then I went to John Conley, for example. He was governor of Texas. Conley wanted to be vice president. And he said, well, I won't fight it. I won't support it. And went to governor of Tennessee and the governor of South Carolina and various ones, and got them actually to say, all right, if that's Humphrey's position, we'll support it. About midnight that night, Bill Welch, a guy on Humphrey's staff, woke me up and he said, you've got to come help us. Johnson's people have moved in here, and they're going to beat this platform resolution. I said, what about Hale Boggs? They said, we can't find him. He's gone, we can't find him. And so what Humphrey wants to do is get some kind of compromise plan. And I said, and incidentally, Humphrey's choice for vice president was down to me and Muskie, Ed Muskie then. And I said, there isn't any compromise. And I used the word Robert Kennedy taught me. I said, this is a time for some moxie. He's just going to have to stick with this thing. They said, well, they'll beat us. I said, that's so much the better. I mean, he just stick with it. I can't help you write the compromise. There isn't any compromise, either for it or not. Well, Muskie helped them draft the report, and the platform plank, and that's where we went. Well, I left Chicago. Well, first of all, I might tell you on the vice presidential thing. My hotel suite was one floor down from Humphrey's, and he was going to, by 10 o'clock the next morning, he was going to announce his vice presidential choice. And I'm getting hourly reports from his staff and from Mondale, and Mondale's from the same state, Minnesota, and it's down to you and Muskie and so forth. And he went to bed last night. The guy that giving him a massage says, well, who had you rather be with, Mondale or Harris? And the mayor of Pittsburgh was for Muskie, and the mayor of Philadelphia was for me. The head of the AFL-CIO was for Muskie. The UAW head was for me, Walter Luther. And Humphrey had a lot of trouble making a decision anyway. Well, it's 10 o'clock the next morning, came and went, and no press conference. And so we're waiting around to see what he's going to do. And little what he called, I thought, well, he's not going to announce his choice unless he calls me. And sure enough, he called. He said, Fred, could you come up? So I went up the back stairs to his room, walked through the living room and his suite and went into a bedroom. He took me into a bedroom and closed the door and said, anything in your background that would be embarrassing to me if you were my choice. And we talked. I said, heck no. Not a thing. I'm not going to tell you everything. Then he said, excuse me for a moment. I'll be right back. He closed the door. He left and closed the door. I think Larry O'Brien or somebody has written this up. In a minute, he came back into the room again, and we talked some more. And then he said, excuse me a minute. He left, closed the door, and then he came back the third time, and he said, with tears in his eyes, Humphrey was a very emotional person, and we were very close friends. He said, Fred, I'm going to have to choose the older guy. So I said, well, if you are, I'll nominate him. So he said, well, would you go with me to tell him? Turned out Muskie was in the other room. So Humphrey and I walked into this room. Muskie's over in the corner of the room. He turned around, and Humphrey must have been the longest sentence Muskie ever heard. He said, Ed, shake hands with the man that's going to nominate you. And I did nominate. Well, I went home. I came back to Oklahoma. I gathered a bunch of my supporters in Oklahoma City and reported on the convention, which was terrible, as you know. It was just an awful convention. A police riot is what it was. And I told him, I said, this is my vice presidential suit. I brought it for nothing, I guess. But before we left, Humphrey and I met with Larry O'Brien and got him to agree to be chairman of the Democratic Party. And, I later followed him as chairman. And so I didn't do much in the campaign for a while. And then Larry called me and said, would you join the plane? Because Humphrey's going to make a speech on Vietnam, a nationwide broadcast. So I got on the airplane in Los Angeles. And we flew around California and then up to Oregon, and then finally wound up in Salt Lake where he's going to do the broadcast. And all the way, other people are joining the plane, and we're all arguing about this, what this plank's going to be, or what he's going to say in Vietnam, and we're about to say it, have to say it. And we wound up in Salt Lake in a hotel room, and Humphrey is in a swivel chair, and we're all around him in a circle, and he's just. I went to bed, I don't know, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and it still wasn't settled. And when I woke up the next morning, it's still going on. And the argument went on for a very short time ahead of what we had to put the speech on the teleprompter. So we went to the station then, and the operative paragraphs, there were 3 operative paragraphs which were mutually inconsistent. The one said that we ought to have an unconditional bombing halt. That was the first paragraph. And the second paragraph was that the other side ought to do these things first. And then the third paragraph was, and if they don't, then we're just really going to keep on bombing the hell out of you. Well, Humphrey made his speech, and there was a short delay before it went out on the network. And I'm sitting in the studio with him. We were backstage going to watch it. But he went to a phone off on the side and called Johnson and told him when it was too late. It was already being fed to the network. And he came back pretty ashen, so I can imagine what Johnson must have said to him. Well, I went back to the hotel on the press bus because I wanted to see what's the lead. What's the press going to say? And they were in the damnedest arguments you ever one said, you know, this is a clear break with Johnson. And said, no, this is just the same old stuff, you know. But Ted Kennedy, who up at that time had not endorsed Humphrey, did immediately. He said, this is a peace speech, and this is a clear break with the president's policy, and I endorse Humphrey. And that went out of all at the same time. And somehow the whole thing came across as much more of a peace speech than it was. And Humphrey began to go up in the polls from that moment. But it was too late.
Do we have time for some questions from the audience? You want to take this? Who has the other mic? Pass it around.
Is it ready? I'm Carl Slater from Seattle, Washington, and the part of your speech was interesting about the talk about the man and the dog and the automation. The problem I see is that no one is thinking about what the ramifications of that are. I worked in technology for 47 years, and I think the real crunch is further away than people think. But nevertheless, to the truck driver out here reading Popular Mechanics, which is a little bit like a nice Fox News in technology, it's really a big deal and very worrisome. And I think we need college chairs and departments working on what we're going to do psychologically and physically, every possible way on this subject.
Yeah.
So your question is what the senator thinks about this subject?
I want the senator to go start doing the thing.
I think some of it, you're going to just have to more or less put some of those people on the payroll. Because, you know, a lot of these old coal miners, you're not going to change into child care people or computer people or whatever. And so we're going to just have to pay them for a while. That's, you know, it's just like unemployment compensation, but just make it much longer. And then, and it's going to get worse, as you know. For example, the son of a very close friend of ours, a neighbor, who just here lately quit Microsoft to go to work for Mercedes-Benz, and what he's working on, he's just a whiz and paid huge money, is driverless trucks. These, I mean, that seems like a weird thing. It's like Flash Gordon when I was a kid growing up, but it's going to happen.
India's working on driverless trucks and cars. For God's sake, I mean, it's the last place you need to be displacing workers.
Yes.
And this is happening all over the world.
Yeah. No way to stop it, I guess, but we're going to have to.
Okay, we had a question over here for you.
I wanted to ask Senator your wisdom on the idea of, the example of South Africa very bravely addressed truth and reconciliation, and that has not solved their problems, but at least it has put some daylight on them. We have not ever had such a thing here. And I think that sin of our nation is, it won't go away. Can you come up with an idea of how to do that, how to talk about what we have done to part of our population? And also the second part of that is what kind of reparation would make sense there, would work?
There's a guy named Jeff Foe, who's an economist, used to head the Economic Policy Institute, wrote a chapter in this book that we're about to come out with on the Kerner. And he talks about that kind of a thing at the community level. And I think it brings to mind what we did years ago in Lawton, long before the Civil Rights Act and so forth. My then wife, LaDonna, sort of headed it up, and a lot of us were involved in it. The mayor appointed me to head up a commission on integrating the restaurants in Lawton. You know, we were doing really good. We had all the restaurants gathered in the city hall, and things were going very well. People, we kind of planned it, getting up and saying, "Well, I'll be glad to," because we want them to see. Well, you know, if everybody does it, you won't be hurt out of this if you open up your restaurant. And that was all really going very well until this old woman who, a very popular greasy spoon she had, she said, "Well, I'd like to say something." And I thought, okay, maybe this boy, she's coming around. She said, "Well, what I'd like to know is this. If we don't want to eat with the coloreds, why do the coloreds want to eat with us?" Our meeting kind of blew up. But all the time, this other thing was happening. That is, we formed a thing which just came to be called the group. And it was purely, well, it wasn't purely social, but it was social. And it met in a black home one week, and the next week in a white home. And everybody had a few drinks, and you had a potluck dinners and so forth. And the first time, most people ever, in a social setting, had any contact with each other in Lawton. And it developed where you began to say, well, why don't we do something about J.C. Penney's? They don't have any black employees. And we had the Fort Sill, the Army would put people off limits businesses. That helped us. But that group thing, it just really worked. Starting out just social. And Jeff Fole thinks we could somehow have some kind of a thing like that in communities again. Now, when I was in the Oklahoma State Senate, I authored a bill that created the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission. And among other things, outlawed discrimination in state employment. Well, similar things that were done all around the country, but now they've been eliminated. That's been true, for example, the Women's Commission in New Mexico has been eliminated. So I think there may be something to that if you could somehow do that. I know that if we continue to be segregated, the great majority of people are not going to be that interested in the quality of schools of people who are living in poverty still.
So, Senator Harris, I would like to thank you for your service in the Senate and especially your work on the Kerner Commission. This is a question of curiosity. The manner in which you selected the people who testified before the commission interests me. There was a friend of mine who appeared before the commission named Ernie Chambers.
Yeah.
And Ernie was, at the time, a barber, a regular barber in Omaha, Nebraska. He had not been yet elected to the Nebraska unicameral state legislature. And so my question to you is, how did the commission go about choosing people who were so representative of the common people rather than dignitaries who did not have credentials or the ability to be able to speak for the common people?
We had a wonderful executive director, David Ginsburg. He grew up a Jewish boy in West Virginia, and somehow, I don't know how he went to Harvard Law School eventually, and he was a clerk for William O. Douglas on the Supreme Court, a New Deal guy, and he's just the most sensitive person you can imagine, and somehow that was one of his aims. For example, when John Lindsay and I spent some time, for example, in Milwaukee, I spent a morning in a black barber shop. And I learned something right quick. I would ask these men, it was all men that I talked to, come in, and they'd come from Birmingham or Jackson, Mississippi or somewhere. And I had a kind of a standard question I started asking them. Did you find more discrimination in Birmingham or in Milwaukee, where you are now? All of them told me, they'd come there looking for jobs and they hadn't been able to find jobs and so on. they were puzzled by the question. And finally, I discovered that in Milwaukee, they didn't see any white people. There was more segregation in Milwaukee than there was back where they'd come from. Well, David Ginsburg was really, I think, the one who was that was mainly important in making us talk to real people.
A question here. Senator Harris, I want to add my voice and my thanks to all the work that you've done on behalf of the people of the United States and people who are at the margins, really. One of the things you mentioned was that in the story you told about the person who asked you if you believed in majority rule. And the bipartisanship that we have is so wide right now. And this concept of majority rule is very much a zero-sum concept. And it's kind of, if we win, you're going to lose. And as we struggle to continue the American experiment, to now create a fully multiracial, multi-ethnic, multisexual democracy, where we have so many different points of view, if you were to be part of a new constitutional convention, could you envision a different way of decision-making and a different way of distribution of power and resources that doesn't require somebody always loses and somebody always wins?
I wish I was smart enough to give you an answer to that. I mean, I like to aim, but I don't know the how. But I do want to say this about, I don't know, do you all know a man by the name of William Barber? Yeah. Now there's the future of this thing right there, William Barber. He started organizing those Moral Mondays, and he wants all kind of people involved in them. White labor union people, from Service Employees International Union, and anybody. He said we've all got the same enemies. That's the way he said, and we better organize ourselves. I think that's the way we've got to go somehow, is to help people say, you know, and I think Reverend Barber would say that. All the people who are in that kind of a coalition don't have to love one another. I wish they would, but all they've got to do is recognize they've got common interests, and if they get themselves together, they're a majority. That's a hard thing to get across. I've seen it done, and you can see it done with Reverend Barber's operation, and that's spreading around the country.
He's our best politician in North Carolina. Right?
Yeah, you're down there.
He really is. Yes.
Let me just say this last thing. When I was running for president, I went down and I had a rally in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, very close to where my people grew up. It's the first time I really was around black people at all. When I was 12 years old, I went down there 12 years, went on a train, spent a good part of a summer down there with my relatives. And incidentally, we were walking down the street. This fellow was maybe second cousin or something, older guy. And we saw a black man, gray-haired, walking down the railroad track, going to intersect with us. We were walking down this dirt road. And he called him, the man over called him by his first name, of course. And he said, I want you to see, he called him Cliff, my grandfather. He said, I want you to meet Cliff's grandboy. And then he said to me, this is your grandfather's, and he used the N-word. I mean, just like a slave said this, when he lived here. The old man, I'm a 12-year-old boy, he took his hat off, and he said, do you mind shaking hands with a colored? And he said, I don't mean anything by it, but I want to meet Mr. Cliff's grandboy. That's really first connection I ever had. And maybe that had some effect. It had a profound effect on me, I know that. Anyway, at Hattiesburg, I said, I was in Minneapolis last night, and I told this group I'm headed to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I put together some of my Choctaw friends of the nearby reservation, and there's a lot of African-American people, and some of my redneck kinfolks from up there in Newton County and so forth. And I told them in Minneapolis last night, I'm on my way to Hattiesburg, and I'm going to put together the best-looking political rally you ever saw, or the damnedest race riot, one or the other. But I said, when I was 12 years old, I visited my relatives, stayed with them for part of the summer up in Decatur. And they lived in an old house. Somebody in the family had once had money. A great old house built with heartwood pine, unpainted inside and out. Wonderful, with that dog run through the middle. And they had a couple, probably in their 40s, I imagine, a black couple, that came, spent the whole day cleaning that house. They washed the walls with lye water, and they got all the bedclothes out and hung it and so forth. They washed everything, and they paid them for a hard, long day's work with a bucket of molasses syrup and a canned jar of green beans. And I said, that's the reason, my kinfolk didn't know it, but that's why they're working for 25 cents an hour. And I had one of my old kinfolks, a great uncle, came up to me with tears in his eyes. He said, I've waited all my life to hear somebody talk like that. So I know you can do it, if you talk about the common interest. But we have to do it, I think.
We do. Senator, we can't thank you enough for being with us tonight. Chick, I believe you have something.
Chick, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That applause comes from the heart of a lot of people who love you.
Thank you.
And we appreciate so much what you meant to us back 50 years ago. Not only did you beat Bud Wilkerson, that's a pretty good deal, but you cared about us.
Thank you.
And you spent time. Many of us got to know you here as a U.S. Senator, a bunch of college students, and you spent time with us. Just amazing. And you were just on the right side of virtually every issue. And what a privilege to spend this evening with you, where we have a small, very small token of our appreciation. But I'll tell you, part of it is a orange and black tie, and we expect to see you the next time you're in Norman. We expect to see you wearing that tie.
All right, Chick.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Very good.